The sun was beginning its descent behind the distant mountains, casting an orange glow over the dusty town of San Felipe. Inside the small, modest chapel, a lone figure stood before the altar. Her dress, once white and gleaming, now seemed to soak up the muted light around her, giving off a dull, almost ghostly hue. Elizabeth Hartley stood there, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the veil that covered her face, hiding the tear tracks that marred her porcelain skin. She had always imagined her wedding day differently, full of joy, laughter, and love. Instead, today felt like a cruel twist of fate. The church was quiet, the air thick with the scent of roses and incense, but there was no music, no jubilant whispers from friends and family, only the oppressive silence and the weight of a decision she could not undo. Her fiancé, James Monroe, was late. Elizabeth had known James for years. He was a strong, quiet man, his broad shoulders and rugged features often softened by his gentle eyes. But there was something about him, something hidden in the depths of his past, that had always kept her at arm's length. She had grown to love him, in her own way, but it wasn't the kind of love she had dreamt of. It was a love rooted in duty, in tradition, not in the heart's deepest desires. She heard the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway, but it wasn't James. It was the priest, Father Donnelly, coming to offer his last words of encouragement. "Miss Hartley," he began, his voice a soothing balm to her nerves, "you needn't rush. If this is not the right choice, you can leave now and no one will hold it against you." Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had thought about running, thought about leaving it all behind, but what would she be without him? Without the safety of the life he promised, what would her future look like? The choice was hers to make, yet it felt as though it had already been made long ago. "I'll wait for him," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He'll come." Father Donnelly studied her for a moment, then nodded and retreated, leaving her in the solitude of her thoughts. Suddenly, the doors creaked open, and James entered. He was as handsome as ever, but there was a hollowness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. His usual confident stride was hesitant, his broad chest rising and falling unevenly, as if he, too, was struggling with some unspoken weight. Elizabeth's heart fluttered as she locked eyes with him, and in that moment, everything else faded into the background. For a brief second, she saw the man she thought she knew, the man who had promised her a future, a home, a family. But then, just as quickly, that image fractured, and the man before her was a stranger. She didn't know if it was the stress of the moment or the growing sense of dread that had settled in her bones, but something inside her whispered that this wedding would not be the beginning of their own story, but the end. "James," she said softly, her voice trembling as she tried to hold back her emotions. He gave her a small, strained smile, his lips tight as though he were fighting an internal battle. "Elizabeth," he replied, stepping forward. I'm sorry, I can't do this." Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place as the world seemed to stop around her. She had expected this on some level, but hearing the words spoken aloud shattered something inside her. "What do you mean you can't do this?" she asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. James ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darkening as though haunted by something beyond her reach. I have a past, Elizabeth, a past I should have told you about before we got this far. I can't marry you, not like this. I've been living a lie, and I can't drag you into it." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Her pulse raced, her mind reeling with confusion and hurt. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her chest tightening, as if the air had suddenly grown too thick to breathe. He sighed, a sound full of pain, regret, and something else, guilt. "I'm not who you think I am," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I've done things, terrible things, things I'm not proud of. I didn't want you to know. But now I see I can't go through with this, not when you deserve more." Elizabeth felt her legs give way, and she sank into the pew, her mind racing. She wanted to cry, to scream, but all she could do was sit there, trying to piece together the man she thought she knew with the broken stranger who stood before her now. James stood there, his gaze full of sorrow, but there was nothing he could say that would undo the damage. He had made his choice, and now so had she. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, then turned and walked out, leaving Elizabeth alone in the silence of the chapel. Elizabeth sat alone in the chapel, the sound of James's retreating footsteps still echoing in her ears. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed his absence, and now the very air around her felt thick with uncertainty. Her chest heaved with emotion, and though no tears came, a deep ache settled in her heart. She had wanted so much to believe in him, to trust that the life they had built together would be the one that filled her heart with happiness. Now, she was left with nothing but the cold echo of his words and the unanswered questions that clawed at her soul. The world outside the chapel was starting to fade into twilight, and yet Elizabeth could not move. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, staring at the empty doorway, but when she finally rose to her feet, her legs were stiff, and her mind was swirling with confusion and pain. She needed to leave, to escape the confines of the place that had once promised a future, but now seemed to mock her dreams. As she stepped out into the fading light of the western evening, the weight of the air pressed down on her like a heavy cloak. The wind rustled the dry, brittle leaves of the trees that lined the dirt roads, and the distant hum of life in San Felipe carried on, indifferent to the storm raging in her heart. Elizabeth began walking, her feet taking her through the town, but she had no real destination in mind. She felt disconnected from everything, as though the world had moved on without her. She passed the familiar buildings, the bakery where she used to buy warm bread every morning, the market where she had once dreamed of shopping for her future home, the saloon where the men gathered to talk politics and exchange wild stories. Now, they seemed like shadows, ghosts of a life that no longer existed. Her mind kept returning to James and the things he had said. A past he couldn't share, things he was ashamed of. What could that possibly mean? And why had he waited until the last possible moment to reveal it? But then, as if drawn by an unseen force, Elizabeth found herself standing before the livery stable at the edge of town. She had not meant to come here, but there was something about the place that seemed to call to her. The low whistle of wind through the open door was the only sound that greeted her as she stepped inside, her boots crunching over the dry hay scattered across the floor. She wasn't sure why, but something urged her to approach the far stall where a lone horse stood, its dark eyes watching her intently. She had always been drawn to horses. There was something about their strength, their grace, and their quiet intelligence that soothed her. But it wasn't the horse that had caught her attention. It was the figure standing near it, his broad back to her, wearing the familiar coat she had seen countless times before. James. His presence hit her like a wave, and for a moment her heart stopped. What was he doing here? Had he come to explain himself, to beg for her forgiveness? She stood frozen, unsure whether to move forward or turn and flee. "Elizabeth," James's voice broke through the silence, rough and strained. He didn't turn to face her, his attention still fixed on the horse. "I thought you'd be gone by now." Elizabeth didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to yell at him to demand answers, but another part, one she hated, still longed to understand. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the words were too heavy to carry. James sighed deeply, the sound full of frustration and regret. Slowly he turned to face her, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me now," he said softly. "I didn't want to lose you before I even had a chance to make things right." Elizabeth stepped back, the weight of his words settling over her like a storm cloud. "You've already lost me, James. You can't just walk into—"
"Tell me you're not the man I thought you were and expect me to just, what, understand?" His eyes softened and he took a tentative step toward her. "I never wanted to hurt you, Elizabeth, but the things I've done, they haunt me. Every day I try to outrun them, but I can't. I never wanted you to be a part of that darkness." Her mind spun, torn between the part of her that wanted to flee from the man who had shattered her dreams and the part that still believed in the goodness he once showed her. She had never known James to be cruel. He was kind, quiet, and gentle, yet something in his past had turned him into a man full of secrets. "I don't understand," she whispered, her chest tightening with emotion. "What happened to you?" James hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment, as if searching for the words to explain himself. "Before I came here, I was a soldier," he said, his voice low and filled with pain. "A soldier in a war that's long over, but the scars it left, they don't fade. I did things, Elizabeth, things I can't take back. I've been trying to bury them, but they keep following me." Her heart thudded in her chest as his words sank in. Elizabeth knew the scars of war,
She had seen them in the men who passed through San Felipe, their faces hard, their eyes haunted. But James had always been different. He had never shown the anger, the bitterness, the pain that those men carried. She had never imagined he was one of them. "I never wanted you to see that side of me," he continued, his voice cracking. "I wanted to be someone you could trust, someone who would give you everything you deserve. But I'm not that man. Not yet." Elizabeth stood there, torn between her heart's desire to comfort him and her head, which screamed at her to walk away before she was hurt again. But then, in a moment of quiet clarity, something shifted within her. She wasn't sure what it was, whether it was his vulnerability or the quiet strength she had always seen in him, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was more to him than she had ever known. "Maybe you're not the man I thought you were," she said slowly, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I don't think that means you can't be the man I need." James's eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time that day, a genuine smile tugged at his lips. "Do you really mean that?" Elizabeth nodded, a small, hopeful smile of her own forming. "I don't know what the future holds, James, but I'm willing to find out." The days following their encounter at the livery were a blur of emotions and unspoken promises. Elizabeth had returned to her small, weathered home on the edge of town, trying to make sense of the tangled web of feelings that had been set in motion by James's revelations. She couldn't ignore the quiet, nagging pull that still tethered her to him, but she was also cautious. She had learned long ago that the path of the heart was rarely straightforward, and James's past was like a storm on the horizon, waiting to sweep them both away. James, too, had retreated. He hadn't come to her again, but she sensed his presence in the town, at the far edges of the saloon, working late into the night at the general store. The walls between them had grown thicker, yet the connection they shared felt like a fragile thread, holding them together against the pull of doubt and fear. Elizabeth had been busy with the small daily chores that kept her grounded. There was always something to do, mending, cleaning, preparing meals, or tending to the small vegetable garden out back, but her thoughts were never far from James. Every day, she wrestled with the weight of his absence, the uncertainty of their future, and the mystery of his past that lingered like a shadow over them both. One evening, as she sat on her porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills, she heard the familiar sound of hooves approaching. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Elizabeth," James's voice came from behind her, quiet but steady, like a heartbeat she had once trusted. "Can we talk?" She glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something in his voice, something raw and earnest, that made her breath catch. Without saying a word, she stood and walked to the edge of the porch, her hand resting lightly on the railing. James dismounted and stood a few feet away, his hat tipped low, his face shadowed by the dimming light. He was still the man she had known, but there was something different now, a vulnerability in his posture, an openness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking about what you said," James began, his voice rough with emotion, "and I want to try. Elizabeth, I want to make things right. I don't know if I can ever be the man you deserve, but I want to try." Elizabeth didn't know what to say. The words he had spoken to her at the livery had stayed with her, echoing in her mind, but she was still unsure. She wanted to believe in him, but how could she trust a man so broken by his past? "I'm not asking for forgiveness," James continued, stepping closer, his gaze intense and searching. "But I want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not running away. Not anymore." Elizabeth swallowed hard, the emotion rising in her throat like a tide she couldn't control. "James, you don't understand. I'm not sure I can be the woman you need either. I'm afraid." His hand reached out, gently grasping hers. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her, and she looked up into his eyes, seeing the same longing, the same ache that mirrored her own. "I don't need you to fix me, Elizabeth," he said softly. "I just need you to give me a chance, to show you that I'm more than the man who's haunted by his past. Maybe together we can find a way to move forward, to make something good out of the broken pieces." Elizabeth felt the walls inside her crumble, just a little. The fear that had held her back, The uncertainty that had kept her at a distance began to dissipate with every word he spoke. "I'm scared too," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I want to believe in us, in something more than the darkness of the past. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm willing to see where this can go." James's expression softened, and for the first time, a real smile broke across his face. He stepped closer, and without saying another word, he took her hand in both of his, holding it as though it was the most precious thing in the world. "I won't ask for more than that," he said, "but I'll prove myself to you, Elizabeth. Every day, I'll prove that I'm worthy of your trust." For a long moment they stood there, hand in hand, the night falling gently around them. The stars began to appear, one by one, as if the heavens themselves were watching, waiting for the next chapter in their story to unfold. Elizabeth didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "I'm willing to try, too," she whispered. James's grip tightened, and without another word he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss. It wasn't passionate, nor was it desperate. It was the kiss of two souls who had come to a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement of the journey they were about to undertake together. As they pulled away, Elizabeth looked into his eyes, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know where this path would lead them. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in her doubts. James was with her, ready to face whatever came next, and that, she realized, was enough. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing one, Elizabeth and James found themselves navigating the delicate path between the past and the future. They spent quiet moments together, working on the land, mending fences, and sharing stories of their childhoods and the hardships they had endured. For every piece of trust they built, another layer of fear melted away. They were no longer strangers, but not yet the people they longed to become either. The small town of San Felipe, still recovering from the effects of a long, hard drought, seemed indifferent to the quiet transformation that was taking place just outside its borders. Yet Elizabeth felt the change within herself every day. Something had shifted, not just in her relationship with James, but in the way she viewed her own life. She had spent so many years dreaming of a future that fit neatly into society's expectations. Marriage, children, the stability of a life planned out for her. But now, as she sat by the fire, in the evenings, watching the embers glow, she wondered if she had ever truly understood what her heart desired. It wasn't the quiet life she had once imagined. It was something deeper, something more unpredictable, just like the man she had come to love. One evening, after a long day spent working the fields, Elizabeth returned to the house to find James waiting for her on the porch, his face lit by the soft golden light of the setting sun. His hands were rough from the labor, his shirt dusted with the earth they had both worked, but there was a quiet peace about him now, an air of someone who had made peace with his past and was ready to build something new. She had never seen him so content. "Come sit with me," James said, his voice warm and inviting. Elizabeth stepped up onto the porch, the cool evening breeze brushing against her face. She took a seat next to him, the familiar sound of crickets filling the air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic chirping of the night creatures and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Finally, Elizabeth spoke. "I never thought I'd find peace out here." James looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly in confusion. "Out here? In the wilderness?" She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last sliver of sunlight dipped behind the hills. "I used to think I needed more. A grand house, a bustling town, a life full of distractions. I thought I needed something to prove that I was happy. But now I see it's not about the things you own or the people around you. It's about finding peace within yourself, with the choices you make." James's expression softened as he took her hand in his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of quiet understanding. "I never thought I'd find peace either. Not after everything I've done, but you—" He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "You made me believe that I could start again, that I wasn't defined by my past." Elizabeth turned to look at him, her heart swelling with feelings she could no longer contain. "You're not defined by your past, James. You never were. You've always been so much more than that. And I—" She hesitated, her breath catching in her throat as her heart seemed to beat in time with his. "I've come to realize that I love you, not the man I thought you were, but the man you've become." A slow, tender smile spread across his face, and for a moment, all the years of uncertainty, all the fear, all the doubts they had carried with them, seemed to vanish. There was no more room for the past, only the present, only the promise of what they could build together. "I love you too, Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice so soft, so sincere that it wrapped around her like a warm blanket. "And I'll spend every day proving it to you." Elizabeth's heart fluttered as she leaned into him, her head resting on his broad shoulder. "I'm ready for that, James. I'm ready to build a future with you, whatever that looks like." James chuckled softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her hand. "It's going to be a hard road, you know. There's still a lot we don't know about each other, a lot of challenges ahead." Elizabeth smiled, her heart full, her soul content. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered, "not when I have you by my side." And so, as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Elizabeth and James sat together on the porch, their hands intertwined, their hearts in harmony. The future was still uncertain, filled with the unknown and the unanswered. But for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth knew one thing for sure. No matter what came, they would face it together. The darkness of the past, the mistakes, and the pain were all behind them. Ahead, there was only the promise of a love reborn, stronger and more beautiful than either of them had ever imagined. As the night wrapped its cool arms around them, Elizabeth whispered into the stillness, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. "We'll be okay, James. I know we will." And for the first time in the stillness of the desert night, it felt as though they truly were.